write down. I do not know how to respond to such low flattery, but in any case. What I would like to do tonight is not necessarily start a in-depth analysis of deconstruction and architecture, but do a sort of trajectory that goes between history and reminding all of us about some facts, what happened and what is happening at this time, and perhaps rather look at the present on the light of the recent past. So, of course, it's an homage to someone who has fascinated all of us, not only in terms of the content of his thought, but also as an individual, as a personality, as someone who had an incredible generosity, especially vis-à-vis architects, who did not necessarily have the same agenda as he might have had. At least he really tried very hard to go almost on our level, which I would say is much more simple than some of the thoughts that he was having with some of his colleagues. But since we architects think in a simple manner, I thought I would start with a diagram. I don't know how well you can read it on the screen, but I'll explain you what it is. It's the general oversimplification. No, don't do that. This is, I want to see the screen, right? Thank you. Lovely. All right. This is the way generally people describe deconstruction and architecture. In other words, you have a stream, the blue stream down there, with the 7 heroes of American university thoughts during a long period of time. You recognize their name: Barthes, Lacan, Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Lyotard. 7 thinkers who each had their characteristic and their authenticity, but who were somehow free particles within a culture, a very considerable culture, but which had only one thing really in common, which was to question a number of thinkers that had preceded them. And you see the list on the left, whether it is, I can't read them myself here, but I recognize Bachelard, Levi-Strauss, Saussure, and a few others. In other words, much of their project was to deconstruct or to question the project of structuralism. In architecture, we had almost a symmetrical situation. But by no means would I say that the 7 names that I'm going to mention this minute have as much the depth of thought as the first 7. And those 7 were Guéry, Libeskind, Eisenman, Copy, Mulgar, Koolhaas, Hardy, Eisenman, myself. This is this very oversimplified view of the beginning of that story, eventually called Deconstruction. But once again, it's really important to remember that the project that these 7 people had in common, working independently, often on different continents, was really to question the work of the list, which is on the very left of the red arrow, which is Rowe, Venturi, I'll try to read it.
Johnson, Moore.
Well, basically to simplify, but I have it on my screen. Wow. Buffett, Graves, Johnson, Moore, Portuguese, Rossi, Rowe, Stern, Venturi. In other words, the starting point is really against something which was the mainstream of thought during that particular period, which I would describe the 70s, the early 80s. whether it was on the architectural front or on the philosophical front, there is a clear difference between one, call it, I always feel uneasy about the word generation, but certainly a different mode of thought. Those two streaks, the red one and the blue one, very strangely at one moment intersect. And how do they intersect? Stays a little mysterious to me. Of course, there was the word deconstruction. The word deconstruction immediately appealed to architects as soon as in the late 60s we started to hear it. But there were other things. Of course, some of the people in that particular group of architects were somehow trying to escape the historicism, in order to escape the historicism of the group of Buffy, Graves, Johnson, Moore, Rossi, Rowe, etc., were trying to, in a way, reconciliate themselves with the early 20th avant-garde, in which, of course, there was constructivism, but there was also expressionism, surrealism, Dada, etc. So here is the link, Koolhaas and Leonidov, and Hadid and Malevich. And among these, a few of these architects, maybe probably Eisenman and myself, who had been reading a little more of what those so-called, as the American University called it, post-structuralist. Now, perhaps I should say a footnote. Those French thinkers, mostly, were actually far more read in America than they were read in France itself, and certainly by architects. The collision between these two modes of thinking, here I mean the one of the architects and the one of the philosophers, was actually an interesting one, because, as I will come back to this, the return to the reality of an architecture of the past had made us, probably those of us who believed still in the possibility of an avant-garde, or at least of architecture as a form of knowledge, we needed allies somewhere. And these allies, we found them hence not only in the architectural avant-gardes of the 20th century, but also in other fields, in other disciplines. And this is, and then since I'm going to move away from from this slide, the explosion, of course, signifies 1988, the exhibition organized by Wigley and Johnson at the Museum of Modern Art, the whole discussion that continues in the schools, the idea of theory, and people who are here tonight, Wigley, Kipnis, Ingram, Cousins, and many others. The issue of looking at other disciplines is absolutely crucial in this discussion. In other words, it's not only what happens in philosophy, but it's also what happens in the arts, in dance. Here the performance artist Tricia Brown on the roofs of New York, herself making a criticism on the idea of autonomy and of discipline within her field of art. She tries to go away from that by leaving the white space as shown on the left of the art gallery moving to the town. This idea of import and export becomes really important in terms of saying that perhaps architecture is part of a cultural field that has also elsewhere a number of transformation, of transgression, of dissolution, of questioning, which we should be interested in. And that's at a time that one reads, whether it's Calvino, whether it's James Joyce, and of course the philosophers. In my particular case, it's my own interest for the cinema. Very early, probably one of my first drawings, which is directly transposing a famous mode of notation by Sergei Eisenstein, the filmmaker, and turning it into an architectural interpretation, introducing the idea of movement and event in architecture thanks to the device of that mode of notation. The idea of notation, of mode of notation, and taking, borrowing from other disciplines leads to work on a number of authors, in this particular case James Joyce, a point grid in order to get access, a mediation if you want, a point of access to the work of James Joyce. A point grid is invented, it becomes a starting point we'll talk about later. With Lavilette, we are here around 1976, 1977. What is important is that the architecture itself is there to question, not to provide answer, but simply to question its role in society. The word folie is, at the time in the late 70s, they were called site-specific sculptures, and I could get budgets from the Arts Council in equivalent in New York to build those small constructions. Their attempt were not to be pieces of sculpture, but much more questions into the city architecture. And ultimately, the Manhattan Transcript, and I don't want to get in detail here, was nothing but this sort of questioning from the park to the street to the tower to the block. They all were looking at some of the certainties of architecture, saying, watch it, this is a dictionary of received ideas, let's look where it doesn't quite fit. 1982, the Parc de la Villette competition arrives. Many of my generation decide to make the competition, enter, in my case for the first time, and doing a real competition, and start to look at a distance, not on a way of perception, not on a way of projecting sort of preconceived images, but almost like a catalog saying, hey, there are so many different ways we can start to work on something. And as you will see on the image on the left, the point on the bottom right of it, the point grid of the Le Corbusier plan voisin, or again at the bottom, the point grid being transposed on the site of La Villette. Simultaneously, each of these drawings was simply looking at other hypotheses, the regular grids, the bands and all that, and you recognize even project by Zaha Hadid or by Grant. Behind this, why was the plan voisin interesting? There was a book on every desk of every architect in town. It was a book called Collage City by Colin Rowe and Fred Cotter. Colin Rowe was defending an argument, which was one which was taken by all the postmodern believers, that the city on the left, Victoria in Spain, was a much better model for architecture than the city on the right. The plan voisin, Le Corbusier, was universally hated, and the point grid there so discredited that it seemed interesting to re-explore it again. So namely, that was the starting point of the point grid. After that, we had a set of movements, vectors of movements, lines, and a series of planes, point-line planes. You recognize a bit of the constructivist avant-garde and of Kandinsky. But there, together with the literature of James Joyce, or some presidents of the avant-garde, was the starting point of an exploration which was there not to design an image. That's why I'm so cautious at the notion of iconicity, but more at providing a mode of thinking. Important maybe to bring back a little bit of history. On the image on the left is an extraordinary project by one of the heroes of that historicist postmodernist period, Leon Creer, who had done on the same site 6 years before the real competition a study which had impressed every one of us when it was first revealed. On the right was the only other architecture finalists of the 10 finalists who were landscape architects, Rem Koolhaas, who also had tried to question a number of issues about modes of organization in architecture, and in particular the idea of the peak competition in Hong Kong. In other words, the genuine feeling that something was happening and that was a new, fresh ground for exploration, which was not necessarily only about opening, as we said, a new type for the 21st century, but also setting a question for our present time. So, fragments, I don't need to go through this, you all know the project. But I would like to now to go back to what happened when it became clear, at least to me, that the project of architecture could only expand on its margins and not at its center. When I was early on talking about architecture, art, film, literature, philosophy, I remember, I think it was around 1982-83, giving a lecture in Barcelona and being booed by the audience who chanted, architecture is architecture, theater is theater, cinema is cinema, do not confuse them. In reality, if architecture was something that, in order to avoid the trap of its own historicity, if it had to look outside itself, maybe it was important to do some of the gardens at La Villette, at gardens that would provide the collaboration, if I can use this word, between people from different disciplines. And in that way, I thought of having the artist Daniel Buren and Jean-François Ricard and a landscape architect working together, and thought that maybe since we had been, and I knew that Peter Eisenman, who had never met Jacques Derrida before, was interested in his work, I thought, well, I have an idea. Let me call Derrida and let's talk and let's see what we can do. The anecdote is now very well known. I can just put it, these are the drawings that go with a text that he wrote about the follies that he left. But the very interesting thing, the first thing as he sat down on this very small room in a small office that I had near the Gare du Nord in Paris, he said, Bernard, why are architects interested in deconstruction when deconstruction is anti-form, anti-structure, anti-hierarchy? I, of course, responded precisely for this reason. Now, let's look simply at one of them. Hierarchical opposition. You all know these. Solid and void, figure and grounds, light and shadow, vertical versus horizontal, plan versus section, good versus bad, pitch roof versus flat roof, inside versus outside, presence versus absence. That's the general vocabulary of architects, even today. So how couldn't we architects couldn't be intrigued by a thinker or generation of thinker, because here I think I have to put Barthes, Foucault, and Baudrillard in that group, together with Jacques Derrida. How couldn't we be interested in thinkers who were questioning, like Derrida, ethnocentrism, where postmodernism was European-based, regional and classical? Look at Bob Stern, look at Leon Creer, look at Venturi. On logocentrism, when architecture at the time was all about autonomy, and of course I was interested in interdisciplinary, intertextuality rather, or when even those architects most likely to question the above kept arguing about the metaphysics of presence. So inevitably certain words came about: difference, disjunction, displacement, disprogramming, de-distracts, the event, etc., etc. The garden the garden started to unfold. The collaboration between different artists and landscape architect worked up to a point, and quite an extraordinary debate and discussion developed between Jacques Derrida and Peter Eisenhower. A debate which included a number of other people. I represent Ritchie, who was part of the team there, and a number of discussions which are, put together in a very lovely book called Choral Work, showing here the sketch of one sketch by Jacques Derrida himself, and some words, some argument between myself and Peter about the genealogy of the point grid, somehow the low point, I would say, of this discussion. I maintaining that my point grid was 2 years earlier, came from Joyce Garden, but eventually saying, look, this maybe comes from that, and here we're back to the Plan Voisin. After all, your Canareggio is a Le Corbusier project, and your point grid is a Le Corbusier point with each of the black chords on the drawing on the right. An interesting discussion about choral works. I think eventually everybody gained from the debates, and unfortunately for a very mundane budgetary reason, the project was never built. For me, the points were only one part of it. Movement was essential. There's no architecture without movements and all the lines. Field and arbitrariness and random events are just as important, hence the general strategy of the project, and again, no need to go through it. It's what it is. During the competition, as Rem Koolhaas and myself were the two finalists, we decided that we had a dinner together one evening in New York, swore to one another that we would reveal to one another everything that we knew about the organizers and our competitors. Of course, we never did. But basically, at one moment, he says something quite interesting. Bernard, do you know that we are the last critical generations? It was a strange question, but eventually, when the exhibition takes place at the Museum of Modern Art in 1988, something quite fascinating dawns on us. The 7 architects, or group of architects, had developed something which was clearly based on a number of thoughts and of, let's say, and I'll come back to that in a minute, of opposition and of positions. Quite different from what happened after that. And here I will venture for you a hypothesis. Today, we have what I call Iconism. It's interesting, September 11, 2001, there is an exhibition at the Max Protest Gallery in New York City, followed immediately by a campaign by the New York Times, to try to find images for New York. And I insist about the word image. Icons, the new icons. Gone was the critical discourse. Gone was the attempt to find certain contradiction or certain subtext within architecture. And I would reckon that this moment we are in today is really dates from that 9/11 moment. Strange passage of architecture and politics, intersection, but something did happen. So maybe I'll finish by showing what I'm concerned with these days is indeed things that have no forms for people who are not human, and doing a very large zoo outside Paris. zoos are fascinating for architects. Letkin did a great ramp for penguins that was apparently, according to the zookeepers, hated by the penguins. Cedric Price with Lord Snowdon did a quite extraordinary aviary. And John Aydock, a fantastic series of houses for different animals in his thesis. My approach here was probably not at all to try to redo La Villette. It was much more asking a question about filters. Architecture is actually filtering the inside and the outside, the good and the bad, etc., etc. And asking myself if the filters that we use to protect the animals against themselves or against preventing them to flee, or the meshes that were used for it could be actually the basis of the architecture for the human as well. And as a result, the whole project becomes a project of meshes indifferently for humans and for animals, and a project of filters that act as the envelopes. As you know, today one of the key words, at least for the last 15 years, has become the word envelope. But is the envelope a filter for an image? And here the work, that particular work, is exactly that attempt to try to demystify architecture by making it as a series of formless filters. I'd like to end with reading a short text. Going back to the idea of positions and oppositions. I read my conclusion to be more precise. 1972, an architecture magazine founded by Eisenman and a few others took its name Oppositions. It was an extraordinarily appropriate name for the time in architecture. The same year, a small book by Jacques Derrida's, with Jacques Derrida's conversation with a few thinkers, came out, and it was called Positions. Positions or oppositions? 1972 is also the year of the demolition of Pruitt Igoe, supposedly the symbol of the end of modernism and the beginning of architectural postmodernism. It's also the year of the completion of the original Twin Towers, the year of Concorde, the supersonic Anglo-French jet. And it's also the year of the publication of Venturi and Scott Brown of Learning from Las Vegas. In Positions, in other words, in the little book, mostly by Jacques Derrida, Derrida, when asked about the relationship between philosophy and non-philosophy, said he tries to stand at the limit of philosophical discourse. He says limits and not depth, because he does not believe that one can today call the death of philosophy or the death of books or the death of architecture exists. Rereading these words, I cannot help but give an architectural slant to it. As quoting or paraphrasing, I try to stand at the limit of architecture theory because I do not believe in the post-critical or in the post-theory. Derrida continued by explaining that he often tried to write with two hands, one that obliterates and the other one that reveals. In other words, Derrida pointed out his famous statement, to deconstruct philosophy, and now allow me to deconstruct architecture, would be to understand, express, employ, and exploit what philosophy, architecture, has as its most constant, and simultaneously try to reveal what has been forbidden and what has been dissimulated or repressed. Thank you.
I heard that Jacques secretly complained to you about working with Peter. Is that true?
Derrida encouraged, I do not know if it's, I think it is translated in English by now, wrote a wonderful book made of a series of texts that came from a number of sources. The title of the book is Psyche or Psyche, and the subtitle is called The Invention of the Other, which is a fantastic subtitle. And in it, there are two texts. The text that Derrida wrote about the part that I read, about some of the things I was trying to do, and the other text about Iconism. Well, he talked a fair amount about architecture in the first text. He talked a lot about Peter in the second text. And therefore, I encourage you to read that text. You'll say much better than I do.
I'll try to formulate this in an easy way. I'm of the opinion that we won, and that we regret winning. And what I mean by that is that we sought to do exactly what you said, which was to unleash architecture to cause a kind of questioning. But if you look at the world of music today, instead of there being a debate, there's this instant bifurcations into new subgenres. So like, it's no longer rock and roll versus pop or something like. It's not the Rolling Stones versus the Beatles, and so the systems of dialectic or even polyphonic oppositional critical thinking, which was to set into motion a kind of liberation of the relationship between thinking and production, has so atomized music that it is simply now the production of interest. There's nothing at stake in terms of, it doesn't seem to be, as soon as you have a slight difference of opinion, you form another genre, you form another group. How music is disseminated today, it just seems like like the world, there are 800 genres on my iTunes. It does seem that that's happening in architecture. Now, I noticed that you trace that to the 2000, the Max Protect show, and it is uncanny how many of the buildings that you showed after that are anticipated in that show. There's no question about that. But is it possible that we have just freed architecture from any responsibility, that it's not a post-critical or post-theoretical situation? It's just we have so succeeded in liberating the architect and providing the tools for the architect to explore any numbers of genres and differences, that there's no way to actually construct a discussion, construct a critical discussion.
I think this is probably the question number one today. Let me, just before I answer, are you all familiar with the filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard?
Do this whether you are or you aren't.
When asked at one moment how he worked, he responded that he would write first a commercial, not necessarily in this order, but he would write a commercial script that he would show to the producer, and telling him, you're going to see the hips of Brigitte Bardot and this thing. And then he would write a non-commercial script, making absolutely sure that the producer would not see it. And on that non-commercial script, he would probably be trying to see, to understand his own attitudes towards filmmaking, towards fade in, fade out, jump cuts, etc., etc. In other words, asking really what was the nature of filmmaking, and eventually abandoning it and moving to television and so on. In other words, taking vis-a-vis his own work a critical stance, knowing full well that you cannot necessarily express it to your sponsor or client. I think we are still in a bit in the same, this type of position. Except what happened, and the we that you brought a minute ago, I understood it as we, the guys who were born in that, developed in this period of the 70s, 80s, 90s, simply opened up a freedom that allowed anything to go, anything goes. And this, of course, cannot be. There are certain fundamental questions that are still there to be asked. And yeah, I would leave it at that.
You're not going to tell us the fundamental question?
Sure, I could. But perhaps one. Perhaps one. Okay, it's the title, just simply, I'm tired, I'm lazy, it's the title of my lecture tomorrow. It's called, it's interesting because one of the words comes directly in homage to. It's concept, percept, and affect. Namely, that architecture is about all these three terms. These are three philosophical terms. Sometimes they're considered as they're said conceived, perceived, and experienced. A lot of philosophers have used that in the last 200-300 years. But this is exactly the definition of architecture. It's a concept, it's an idea, it's something very abstract. It's a perception, you see it, it's a visible, it's an aesthetic. And it's also an affect, it's an experience. But they don't necessarily work independently from one another unless you want purposefully to have these disjunctions. But they are not instant. In other words, you have to know what you're doing. And I have always a problem with the architect who is naive enough to think that he can be careless and be only one thing that ignores the two others. You cannot have an architecture which is primarily conceptual any more than you can have an architecture which is primarily a pure affect. And I think that's the importance of architecture as a form of knowledge. Architecture as the invention of concepts that are materialized is a fascinating part of we are the only ones who do that. Philosophers, mathematicians have plenty of ideas, but we are the only ones, practically, who deal with their materialization. And that gives us a responsibility. And hence when I talk about a concept, percept, and affect, is really to see is the one of the things.
Before I just are there younger practices that capture your attention? Are there practices, not of your generation, but out of school? But I mean, I'm curious, but are there those?
Yeah, I'm not going to give you any names now for obvious reason, but there are a number of people who are educators in this room, and of course we have plenty. There are plenty of them. I'm not worried about the future.
Okay.
I'm worried about the ones who make the headlines in some of the most popular magazines today.
Are there any questions? Can Renata get the microphone? While we're doing this, maybe you could go back and talk more about why you like my project so much. Renata.
It's open? Okay. Oh, just to you, Jeff, because you started 2 questions ago to say, we won. Oh my God, what does it mean? So architecture needs a victory? Is a new way of colonization? No, I don't know, just wondering. I am shocked. Sorry, Jeff. I am your friend.
Yes. Criticality needs, the word would be traction. There has to be something that you see as stultifying or limiting, and you point out that it's not, that it's operating at an insidious level. That even though it seems straightforward, you serve a client, you minimize cost, you make things efficient, whatever the value structure is. The value structure comes with political, cultural, social, and existential implications, and we gained our traction by forming oppositions with that. And I do believe we won. And so, and I'm fairly proud of it. I got tenure, I make a lot of money. So, but let me, before I do, I actually think, for example, if you read cross-programming, trans-programming, disprogramming, written in the late 70s, right? You go to mall design today, or you go around the world today, you will see it in action. It is as if Bernard Tschumi's world thinking became the instrument of developers. And then you get to test it. Does it actually produce a new event turbulence? And we had, so he won. I actually think that theory is not a theory anymore. It is a fact of the way we do organizations and buildings all over the world. And you look at that and you have a chance to test it and you think about it. And so I don't think just we won. I think you can be very specific about the ideas that we're talking about. The idea of a context does no longer match the height, the materiality, and the native language. The idea of a context today is you can reinvent the context in any numbers of ways. You cannot pretend like you're not part of it. So over and over and over again, all the arguments that we tried to make are now just considered, or I think, are basically considered received dogma. I mean, they are now part of the received catalog. And so I think we won. I think Bernard won. To the victor go the spoils. Yes, Catherine.
I don't think this is working.
I'll repeat your question.
I wanted to talk about 9/11, which was the second, September 11th, because that was the text I reread on here. You know, everybody was talking about the text they were rereading for this event, and that was the one that I reread, was the interview of Derrida with Giovanna Bordori after 9/11. And because I wasn't sure why I was reading that one, but he said something in there, because of course he's faced, you know, the whole question is, what does a philosopher do in the face of, you know, catastrophe of this sort? And of course, we already know, even before we go into it, what he's going to say to some degree about, you know, the question of what kind of event it is, and what does it say about America, and what does it say about the world, and so forth. But he does say one thing in there that I thought was kind of interesting, which suggests that critical position can't win ever. I mean, there's never a moment of complete winning. And he said something like, we have to hold on to our freedom in the face of received ideas, and that we have to hold on to the freedom of objects and people and events and relations to assemble themselves in an unpredictable or different way. And that doesn't mean that we can't act and condemn certain actions, which he was very clear that he thought that it was an assault, that 9/11 was an assault on not, you know, the architectural issue. Giovanna Bordori, of course, is bringing up the architectural issues of the assault on the icon of architecture. But it was also an assault on what America stands for but doesn't necessarily deserve, which is that it holds the credit for free society for the world in some way. And that was, and it doesn't necessarily live up to that, or it doesn't mean that America deserves that kind of status, but it holds that credit. And so in a way he was able to condemn it and at the same time say that philosophy goes on and has to go on in the face of you know, the beleaguerments of the world. So to say that you won is to say that the received ideas no longer have any power. And that's partly what you're saying about the different genres, is that because there's so many, they no longer hold you can't hold the attention on them for long enough to see what the conditions of received, you know, idea is or something. It's a problem of distraction or whatever. But I mean, clearly we're in a deeply fundamentalist phase, you know, in America for one reason. And so aren't there still massive kind of conditions that belong to architecture to be engaged within and critical about? And I mean, I can't imagine that now that you know, that everything's dissipated to the point where it has to, yeah.
Very, very briefly, I'm going to tell you what I'm giving this semester to my students in my studio, to which I will want every one of you to come to the final review. It's about representation, and about concept and representation. The architect, if Godard had two types of concern, the commercial script for the producer and the non-commercial script for himself, the architect, to simplify, has first, or in any order, himself or herself, as we heard it as a few minutes ago. He has the client, mostly the developer, and he has the community, you know, people at large. And there was a time when the mode of representation of the architect was quite different from the mode of representation for the developer and the mode of representation for the community. We laughed about it, you know, all those little people in those Venturi's drawings, right? All those lush, hyper-realist, photorealist renderings, all those very complex axonometrics by the architects. You know something today? They come all together into one. There's no more watching one criticize the other. A group that had 14 pages in the New Yorker last month, is wonderful at being able to communicate out of now one single image that coalesces concept, percept, and effect. And this may be a little scary.
Actually, I think it's a fundamental problem. If you go to lectures, particularly of young architects, and they're speaking to their colleagues, they speak to their colleagues exactly the same way they speak to the other clients. They don't speak in an expert language. They don't present as one expert to another, as a doctor might present to another doctor. They present exactly the same way. And I do think you're exactly right about that. And I don't think that's a problem with the available technology. It may just be the youth of the technology. Earlier today, by the way, I want everybody to realize that Bernard Tschumi just invited everybody in this room. Expense paid trip, I'm sure Mark will verify, to come to the final review. If you think Bernard is a great architect and a great here, you ought to go see him as a teacher. The last time I was in a studio, believe it or not, he did one of the most brilliant exercises in a studio I ever did, which was he designed the houses for the Three Little Pigs, which I don't know if you know the story of the Three Little Pigs. But earlier today, I cajoled you, every student, to go and meet the most famous people you know and you will find out, of course, that they will meet your expectations on how smart they are, but also you will find out how flawed they are. All day long, for example, we've been hearing quotes of Jacques Derrida, and I keep thinking to myself, well, that's just wrong. Just because he said it, so what? I'm pretty sure he didn't think everything he said was right. And I want to call attention to something earlier that Peter said. That is, the moment that Jacques Derrida connects with architecture is when he begins to write explicitly political commentary, which for me is the moment the work gets less interesting. I found it more politically, more profound, having greater consequence for our lives before it became explicitly political. And so I thought to myself, what a brilliant observation, but how sad that is.
Amusingly enough, all everyone who in America developed cultural studies and new feminism will disagree with you.
Anyone else?
Can I respond, please?
No. I'm in control.
No, I just want to say, I agree with you, Jeff, actually, about that. I don't think that was the best, I don't think that was the most brilliant work of Derrida there, that interview. And I agree with you that, and it's interesting that he starts, when he addresses architecture, that he starts to, I mean, that's exactly what architecture poses to, you know, the sort of philosophical position. So I agree with that. But at the same time, he wasn't falling into political correctness exactly there, because he wasn't saying, oh, okay, we should all be cosmopolitan, we should all be good citizens to each other and so forth. He was actually searching for a way to open up a new project in the midst of capital and the saturation of, you know, and the project, he said, was, and it's vague, is always towards democracy or something like that, towards, not arriving at, but I don't know. So it's a little, you know, fuzzy.
But hang on, everybody. There was a student here who, there you go, sweetheart. Come forward. I'll translate for you.
It's more like, when you were talking about Godard, it's more like, I don't think this is a question, but it's more like, footnote. Godard's exhibition in Pompidou. Maybe something, you know, Tschumi, that kind of exhibition, would it be possible for you to think of something that you do that is in the line of Godard's exhibition? Which is in the sense that he tried to open up.
I'll try, because I guess not everyone in the audience knows what the exhibition was, right? Godard, and I don't remember the filmmaker, I don't remember the circumstances, had been asked to do an exhibition at the Pompidou Center in Paris, and took it on a very, very polemical sense. And to such an extent that it was very often sheer provocation. I think there was an anger in that exhibition, a profound anger. And I do not know all the background of it. There were certain things that were directly related to his perception of filmmaking, but a lot of other things which were very much a sort of political explosion against the society was living in. So I cannot, at this moment, make a parallel between myself and him. It's a different story right now. But indeed, I think his exhibition was badly received because it was misunderstood.
Can I make a point, which is also a question, which is in a way all day, there's been talk of like the relationship between architecture and philosophy, as if in some sense that relationship must be a good thing, and therefore you have Jacques Derrida, a very good philosopher, and therefore somehow the relation improves. Now, it's not clear to me that that's fair on architecture, and I'm quite sure it does an injustice to kind of Jacques Derrida. In some ways, I think one of the things that's been forgotten in the day, although not by Bernard, is a certain kind of militancy in Jacques Derrida's opposition to philosophy. Now, it seems to me that in some sense, if I can kind of schematize it enormously and simplify, what was of interest, and I think in many ways still remains so, was the possibility of some people from within architecture making, as it were, some kind of alliance with Derrida to oppose the effect of philosophy on architecture. I could just say a second what I mean by that. I mean, it does seem to me, and I think it's an entirely Derridian thought, that in some sense the task of architectural theory is to get all the accumulated, intrusive other discourses off the back of architecture. In some sense, I'm sure people would agree with that. Deconstruction, it seems to me, was one of the most powerful instruments for doing that. I mean, if you kind of turn the question for a moment, not just the question of what architecture, but let us say I'm looking at this screen, which is also a window. I mean, if you did a Derridian seminar for a term on something like the history of windows, it would be possible to demonstrate how what we used to call ideologies, but that would include philosophies, continuously intervened to freeze and repress the development of other forms of design of windows. And so in that sense, it seems to be what's being kind of not quite specified is the polemical way in which deconstruction helped people, or could help people in architecture, to oppose the unthought accumulation of philosophy. I mean, I especially think, I shan't name him, but of an Australian philosopher who in London, architects, you know, Bob Maxwell and people, they think his lectures are fantastic. It's because he appears to take an architectural problem, and at the end of an hour, at the end of what you might sometimes seem like an incredibly long hour, he has a philosophical solution to it. Everyone comes away with the warm feeling that their humble trade of architectural design is awarded a great philosophical dignity. And it seems to me that we need to be kind of unsparingly in opposition, I mean, and mocking. And that is quite a kind of militant stance, which is in some ways against philosophy.
Sorry, no, just to be the backup singer on this, which is what I think I meant when I said that the real issue is to undo the assimilation of the philosopher's desire to leave architecture behind, which is structuring our own discourse, such that architecture as a discipline works very hard to reassure people that architecture is not interesting. And this goes absolutely against the more or less romantic reason that architects are involved with architecture in the first place. So essentially philosophy is used as the agent of a kind of self-disciplining and even a sort of self-flagellation, although that makes it sound even more interesting than it is, by which architects will deny that architecture is as weird as it is. And the interesting thing is whether you position the thinking of Jacques Derrida as being, as it were, clinging to philosophy even in its attempt to undo it, such that he doesn't work as a vaccine to this effect. So you actually have to do this double move. You have to do a kind of, you have to undo the ever-present ghost of philosophy within the daily operations of architectural discourse, while seeking strategic alliances in the very home of that maneuver, which may require you to ask Derrida to not leave architecture behind. Something like this.
We have been all guilty of one thing tonight, is to take the word architecture and the word philosophy as a general category which was just right.
there are many different philosophies, there are many different architectures. And in this exchange between the two of you, in how I read the subtext, you're talking about a type of phenomenological trend in architecture these days, a sort of vitalism, as I would call it, that goes together with the iconism. And that, yes, I would entirely agree with you that we have to oppose it for every possible reason. But that's almost a different conference.
So, it's been a long day. I think it's been a fantastic day. We also have the privilege of hearing Bernard again tomorrow, and so we can take up some discussions tomorrow. I want to thank everybody for being with us today and sitting through this and your attention. So, good night.